We're going
Children and
now.
dogs. Okay.
And we are live with Marika Pfefferkorn, longtime friend and ally and partner in the work for justice in the Twin Cities. She has done great work locally and nationally with the use of data for the public good, equity in schools and in policy, has worked with one of Minnesota's largest nonprofits, or I shouldn't say largest, but most committed nonprofits to equity. And for purposes of today's discussion, she has worked with Dignity in Schools, the campaign nationally for a rethinking of how we handle discipline in schools. And today is a great day to have you on, Marika, because you and I have had this conversation a lot, and we have had different versions of this conversation about police-free schools. Will it make kids safer? I've expressed to you in the past kind of my cynicism about restorative justice and about the implementation being my main cynicism. Like anytime there is a policy that requires school districts to implement well, I think that policy is doomed. And you know why. You have seen me for years, and you saw my time on the school board and my advocacy, and most everything we tried results in disappointment for me. We have an Office of African American Male Achievement. That was a lot of work to get that done. Took a lot of time and effort to put money into it. We have it. Hasn't made any difference. As a matter of fact, it's the first thing that the superintendent tries to defund every time they have, a problem with the budget. We had PBIS. It was going to make all of our schools safe. PBIS was going to do it for all of us across all the schools. Didn't do it. Not because PBIS isn't a good program, a nationally evidence-based, evidence-tested program to make whole buildings safer, but because it requires schools and school districts to integrate or to implement faithfully. So there's my setup. Marika, there's a call right now nationally. Lots of school boards from Denver to Minneapolis to other places are calling to remove school resource officers out of the classroom. And my question for you is, can that make schools safer for kids?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on today and lifting this conversation up, because there is a lot of chatter across social media and locally here on the ground. So this is a critical conversation to be having. And before I kind of jump into that call to action, I just want to say, Chris, we did have this conversation like 6 years ago. And I want to let you know that having been in this work, I have much better examples of how to disentangle this conversation about implementation and advancing equity and justice policies and practices. So I'm excited to jump into that as well as we talk about the SROs. But yes,
I want to hear it.
Minneapolis Public Schools has divested from their relationship with the Minneapolis Public Schools. And many people are calling it a victory.
With the police.
With the police department, yes, okay. Yes. And many people across the country are celebrating and they're excited because they see this momentum happening. But I think what we have here in the Twin Cities is ground zero, because I don't feel like we actually have gotten to a point where we can celebrate. And I don't think we can replicate the murder of George Floyd in order to get the action that our young people deserve and the justice that our families deserve. So first of all, they did end the contract with the Minneapolis Police Department. However, we've been having this conversation with the Minneapolis Public Schools since 2014. That's when I kind of joined the conversation. And so it's been a very circular one where we make this progress and we make advances, and then there's shifting, there's politics, and there's a step back. And so what our concern is right now is that they only divested from the Minneapolis Police Department. That does not mean that they can't go to the St. Paul Public Schools Department, St. Paul Police Department, or these other entities. And so fundamentally, we have not shifted what it is that is required in order to create safe climates and cultures in these buildings so that we can act and implement these policies to occur. But what you saw today was, or not today, but in the past few weeks, was what young people in the Minneapolis public schools have been crying for. And then Nathaniel Green, who is our student representative on the Minneapolis Public Schools Board, has been advocating for and has been silenced during his term. And so what we're looking at, so literally, as they were making the decision about severing ties with the police department, Nathaniel submitted an amendment because he wanted to assure that his work was not washed away by simply just ending the contract with Minneapolis Police Department. And so in that amendment, he asked them to commit to not, again, engaging with any other police department and focus on the practices, the policies, and the alternatives that we have been talking about in the schools for a long time, which the argument previously has been that it is cheaper to have one school resource officer in a school building to address the issue than it would require to fund the alternatives that would actually shift to a transformational change in our education system.
And when you say the alternatives, you mean counselors?
I would hate for anyone to actually approach that with one answer. So what we're looking at is an ecosystem of response from both inside the district and outside the district. So yes, that includes restorative practices, but restorative practices without a connection to community or without a commitment to having people of color that lead Indigenous approaches to the work. These practices and these contracts don't actually end up with the people that have been doing the work on the ground. And then there's not the level of fidelity to doing it with integrity, and particularly training our white teaching staff in the school districts to buy in. And so they fumbled that process again and again. And so what we're really talking about right now is, as Minneapolis Public Schools is, they've voted on this community redesign process, is they've got resources, they've got funding that they've already redirected to support some of these alternatives. And now we're asking that don't just end the contract, the budget that you had allocated for that, add that to the pool of money that we're using to support these practices. Because what I've seen working an inside-outside strategy is we've hired district coordinators that have been undermined. We have contracted with outside programs and community organizations that have relationship with the school district but don't have the expertise to deliver the outcomes.
I mean, so you're kind of making my point though, Marika. I mean, in some ways that makes my point. It's like, it's not that the idea is bad. It's not that the program that you would want to have is bad. It's that it requires dedicated, competent leadership at the school district level to be able to implement something. And we have a school district that can barely get its pants on in the morning. We have a superintendent who couldn't be more milquetoast and mediocre and has, collected damn near a $300,000 salary for, 3 years now. And he'll probably get $3 or $4 million out of the district before he leaves and ruins the entire thing. We have a school board that basically, good Lord, I can't imagine a more cognitively challenged school board anywhere in the United States. And that's saying a lot because school boards generally are not cognitive superstars. And if it requires that superintendent, that school board to lead the district's principals and area superintendents to help teachers keep schools safe and do it all well, implement this well, man, that makes me cynical. And you just did the right thing. You just told me, like, there shouldn't be an easy answer to this. It shouldn't be some silver bullet. You wouldn't want to approach my question, in an easy way, but it seems like for the type of leadership that we have in this district and probably many other districts too, you got to kind of come up with something that is simple enough for everybody to understand and be able to do. Is that a fair criticism?
Absolutely fair of the system. And my concern presently is that the people that have stalled, put up barriers, have reenacted injustices in this district when it comes to the conversations about SROs are now in charge of driving those solutions. And so in my time with working with Minneapolis Public School, Dr. Eric Moore started out as the director of research. And so we partnered with him when the Office of Civil Rights identified Minneapolis Public Schools discriminating against students, Black and Brown students, when it came to the use of SROs. We also did an equity, diversity, inclusion, and assessment which is a tool that the Minneapolis Public Schools uses to identify if the policies that they enact are having disparate impact on their students. So the Office of Civil Rights told, Minneapolis to get their act together. They committed, they backtracked. And then, as we're trying to hold them accountable to demonstrate that those numbers and the data is not shifting, then they enact those barriers in that wall so we can't get the messaging out. And then after the equity assessment, we presented it to the board and they said, we're an equity board and we're going to support what these things share. And so when we give that information that the SROs are not treating our young people equitably, they disengage from their commitment. Mm-hmm. And the last time I said, the third time, because we've done community engagement around this 3 times in the last 6 years, was that, again, that the resources weren't there and it was cheaper to do the SRO. So what I'm asking is we cannot expect the people that have led us to this status quo moment to lead us out of this change. And they need to be held accountable to the young people that have been impacted so greatly by these SROs. As I look at the data, it is really concerning. And so before we even get into the solutions, for me, it's really about addressing the accountability and the harm that has been perpetuated upon these young people. So one of the things we're asking to do is demanding that the Minneapolis Police Department release that data that they would not share with the Minneapolis Public Schools about what happened to young people once they were handled by the police officer and left the school property. But going back to your point again about how do we do this? So Minneapolis Public Schools has danced back and forth between a centralized and a decentralized school district. What I believe that we need to do is the hybrid approach, because there are principals in the Twin Cities or in the Minneapolis Public Schools that are ready to do this, have tried to do it, and they've been defunded. And so the thing is that bridge is we cannot rely on the Minneapolis Public Schools to fund it. And so that partnership needs to show up so that when Minneapolis Public Schools decides to shift, change the trend after COVID-19 and the state's budget comes out and we don't have money for our schools anymore, we have to come up with an alternative accountability to how we're going to get resources to do this. Because I believe the principal of North Minneapolis, Mari, she can handle this. She can do this. She has a vision. And even if she doesn't agree with removing SROs from schools, she's committed to serving the young people and following through with that commitment. And the same goes for Patrick Henry.
Wait a second now. Let's just be real, Marika. You're talking about a principal that's married to a cop, right? Like a Minneapolis officer, if I'm not mistaken. And I don't mean to put people's business out there, but this becomes one of those things about how much do we trust the system and the people within the system to do the right thing. You're going to start naming people, and everybody that you name in the district, I'm going to tell you has a track record of poorly implementing things, even though they have all the language right. They have the equity language right. They have they've been to all the courageous conversations. They've had all the courageous conversations that you could possibly have, because we're a city that just loves a contract with a consultant so we can have courageous conversations and whatever. And when it comes to implementing something that makes sense for the kids, I don't know what happens and what goes wrong, because I don't want to just call people ignorant, whatever. But let's just say it's nobody's fault, but it happens over and over and over again, is that the community gets sold on accountability, on a plan, on a PowerPoint, on a training, on a consultant contract, on something that is going to make everything better. And I can guarantee you, I can name you, Minneapolis is a graveyard of good ideas. Like, it is a graveyard. I used to call it hospice for good ideas. Now I'm calling it a graveyard of good ideas. And discipline stuff, I can remember it's 2020, so probably about 12 years ago, the district started looking at all the data and pulling it all up and making the case for us needing to do something different with discipline, and putting all the statistics out there and getting everybody kind of educated and knowing what the system was about, or what the problem was about, set off a chain of things that have happened over time. Programs, moratorium on suspensions. I think you're one of the people that pointed out to me that the moratorium on suspensions increased suspensions. Like when they did it, it's not that a moratorium is bad. It's about the way that school districts do things has weird results sometimes, right? So what would stop us from saying that, like, we're going to make kids safer by removing the police officers, and in true Minneapolis fashion, we would watch over the next couple of years and it would make kids less safe?
I would suggest to you that they're currently not safe with SROs in the schools, and that you don't begin building from a deficit. And that there are community members who have been doing this work, and we've seen the impact that it has made. The problem is community members keep getting shut down when they're effective in partnering with the system. So we actually need people like you to raise the warning bell and call them out, so that we can just get to the work, because it is not an acceptable answer for it to be a graveyard when they are serving our Black and brown children.
That's right.
And so for me, that is not enough of an answer for me to say, I give up. I am burnt out on our Twin Cities education justice work, but I do not have the heart to let it go, because I cannot watch another generation experience what I did 47 years ago. So
who do you think makes a good target for us to get, like, when you say we need to kind of like really hold people accountable, like really kind of, do this justice work in a way that calls out the people? Who's the ones that got the power? Who can like really pull the lever to make it happen?
Well, first of all of these decisions that we were making about the moratorium on suspensions and removing the SROs, the school board was what blocked progress in these decisions. So when Bernadette Johnson, superintendent in 2014, surprised people and put that moratorium only on kindergarten and first graders. So let's not go crazy about how we freed our kids from suspensions, that all of a sudden the schools went crazy, because that board member Felder likes to lift that story up. And I was like, let's hold on a second, because we're talking about kindergartners, preschoolers, and first graders. There was not a commitment to a complete overhaul, first of all.
Which is so funny, because I was ignorant to the fact that they were suspending kindergartners. So when they did that moratorium,
preschoolers, Chris, they're suspending preschoolers. I have seen a 5-year-old carried away by 4 police officers.
Jesus.
A 5-year-old black child carried away from a school.
Jesus.
And knowing that he has an IEP, and knowing that he has post-traumatic stress and all these other things going on. And so I really believe that we need to hold our board to account, and call them out about how this is happening and this influence. And at the same time, I know that people are coming for the school board now because they made the decision to sever the contract with the police department. And so it's not an easy answer, because they get all knocked out and they don't even buy in, and then people come in and replace it. And so again, fundamentally, there has to be a shift in our mentality about our response, our belief that the school district is going to do it. And so
who's coming for the school board now? Now they've made this decision. They want to cut ties. They want to have police-free schools. Who would be a group, or
this is such a complicated issue, because we're talking about nonprofits in Minnesota who are dependent on a very small supply of funders. And what I will say to you is, a lot of the people even that have been working to get the SROs out of the schools, their doors are shutting. Because they're not funding education justice. They're not funding removing suspensions. They're not funding that type of work. They've gone on to the next trend. And so like I said, what I'm fundamentally asking for is that the resources be put into the hands of folks that have demonstrated to be effective. Dr. Talea Tolfree, who was a former restorative practices coordinator for the district to help them address their contract with the Office of Civil Rights, did a phenomenal job, but she was fundamentally undermined. She went out in the community and did it outside of that system. It was very effective in partnering with schools at the local level, just not with the districts. And so what we need to do is address the teachers' unions that have a hold on what kind of restorative practices we're going to deliver, or what kind of social, emotional systems we are going to deliver, and really bring that back out to the community. Because when we're looking at a systems approach, it does not think about parent engagement as co-partners. It does not think about young people as co-partners. So I'm at a place where I can do my work is where I will fall. And I will call on people like you, Chris, to continue to call these folks out, because those resources keep going to those places, and those resources can be better spent outside, and then working with those schools that are willing to do the work demonstrate the progress, and everybody eventually is going to have to get on board, or Minneapolis will continue to shrink, and they'll continue to leave another generation of our young people behind, where they cannot be full participants of our economy and our community.
Minnesota hates Black children. So let me do a couple of comments here. Christine Laster says we have a moratorium on suspensions. And the day after it was announced, white teachers were talking about beating up our children, taking guns to work, slapping and spanking our children, plotting and laughing about it. I should make, for the record, there are still, I believe, 11 or more states in the United States that allow for the beating of children by educators in schools. And I don't hear it come up anywhere in terms of people actually talking about it. Like the state can actually hire somebody to beat your child, which I think is kind of the model of American public education. Toya says, pop-pops in schools, which I think actually is a way of talking about having community members in the schools, which in Minneapolis, I think for a long time, in Minnesota, we had a status called community expert that allowed teaching by people in the community that had good ties with folks, the African drummer, the grandma, the cousin, who can help in schools. And somehow I think that got beaten back by the teachers union, because
nobody's allowed in there anymore. Not even parents
can't even get in anymore. So I still am like, I'm listening to you and I feel like the science is on your side. When I listen to you, I believe that we know that the way that we do policing in schools and the way that we handle discipline in schools right now is, one, inequitable, and two, does not serve the master that it's supposed to serve. Like, it's supposed to actually be therapeutic and make schools better for all kids. And it doesn't do that. It doesn't advance education for the kids that get suspended. So all that's on your side. And I keep bringing up and hammering on the same dead horse is we have to find the point of access within the districts where there is somebody who we can trust, who's competent, who can actually execute and monitor, maintain, readjust when necessary. And that seems like it's been a problem.
So, yes, I don't know if you're aware, but there was a purging of African-American women from the Minneapolis public schools. And so folks that have stood up to what is happening are eliminated. Their positions are eliminated. The equity department is eliminated. We're seeing that happening all over the country. So I have to keep reiterating that the resources cannot continue to just go directly into the schools where they continue to circle it around. It needs to a significant, I'm not just saying a nice grant to do a one-year program, but a significant investment in community organizations that have demonstrated the work and the outcomes, because we've seen money go out, but there has not been a change. And so it's not just getting the money out there, but to demonstrated parties that have been doing this work. I don't know the answer, but I do know that when the community has been a part of the change process in the schools, I have seen progress. I have seen significant change. And so there are, like Chris, there are no easy answers. We just need resources. We need people to be held to account. And then we also need to lift up those stories of where it was working, because even with the Minneapolis public schools, while they had the SRO program, they did eliminate the part-time security guards because they demonstrated that they were discriminating against Black and brown children. At the same time that they were talking about reducing the number of school resource officers in Minneapolis, they worked with the youth Minneapolis Youth Coordinating Board, where they had youth workers in some of the sites working there, and they had effective results and outcomes. Ask Jason Matlock, who is the chief of security over at Minneapolis Public Schools. Again, these things have been demonstrated, particularly when it comes from a community approach of them leading the work.
So
us,
I mean,
I should say us.
Now you're hitting on yet another thing that requires the goodwill or competence of a group of people that we're going to have trouble finding it in. And you mentioned the resources, the money, the nonprofit industrial complex of Minneapolis. We're the Silicon Valley of human services, and the funding, the way we get funded for this program or that program is very political. It's not even a smart process in any way, shape, or form. It's just straight up political. Do they like you or don't they like you? It doesn't matter if your work is good or terrible. It just actually matters if who you know and which white philanthropist in our big foundations or token person of color that they've hired can you meet with to help you get your grant and get it through, regardless of whether you do good work or not. And say one wrong thing. This is the way that Minneapolis works. I don't know if you're listening to this somewhere else. I don't know how your city works, but what I can tell you in the Twin Cities is say the wrong thing in a meeting. And by the wrong thing, I mean anything that's pro-Black or radical in any way, shape, or form for your people to make substantial change, and watch your nonprofit budget disappear overnight. Just vanish, just be gone, and watch you'll be in nonprofit Siberia for the rest of your career. You might as well move somewhere else. Sounding dramatic, but I'm sounding dramatic? Yeah, is it dramatic?
It's my experience. And so we have had to operate from a self-determination model. We have not depended on local foundations to support the work that we're doing. What we have is a committed collective of parents, youth, and community members who have been a force holding these school districts accountable for a significant amount of time. And so it would be arrogant and egotistical to think that just our collective could solve the issue. But I know that how we've designed our work is we don't have that accountability to those funders and those systems. And so we are able to speak truth in those places and connect with those people that are ready to do the work. And I believe in a ripple effect because right now, we're doing a disservice to all of them. So my commitment and my focus is on the Black and brown students, particularly on the north side of Minneapolis, who have been completely divested from.
Can I throw you a real curveball here? Because it was a curveball to me when I found it. So maybe I shouldn't have found this shocking. But Minneapolis Public Schools put out a report that is a survey of parents, students, and educators about SROs, to see what their thoughts were, their feedback on SROs were. And I think that they do it every year. I don't know if that's true or not, but I thought I saw it for more than 1 year. But the year that I looked at it's a brand new report or for this year. And it showed that school resource officers are very popular. The kids had positive responses for them. In some cases, the school resource officer was the only Black male in a building that the kids saw ever. And, we're a district that actually needs more models of Black people, like men, especially in the schools. So they said good things the students said good things about SROs. The educators said good things about SROs, that they were part of the school community. They didn't give this like vision that I have of like cops, like being police officers. They almost made them seem like school staff that were, kind of, they were good with kids, they were good with kids and, they were there for, anyways, the point that I'm making is I expected there to be not a great opinion about school resource officers in the schools. And the opinion was actually pretty good from the survey.
So fortunately, I love research also.
Which I'm talking to you.
We did a survey and we took it from the Minnesota State Survey about young people's experiences with SROs. So what I will say is also it's all about the questions. And so we did a comprehensive analysis of relationships with SROs between students and families. And I think you'll find a different story. Kristen Pentek was one of her projects that she was working on at the University of Minnesota. So I'll share that with you in a little bit. But here's what I'll say. We also did a national survey on the relationship with SROs, young people, and parents. And here's what they found. That parents and youth that were in support of SROs were in support of them because they didn't know what else was the option. And so once you did that initial question, we surfaced like, what are your concerns? What are the things that you're thinking about? And then you talked about the different types of alternatives and the different types of ways. And the response has always been, we didn't know, we don't know that those were the things that should have been in place in the first place. So I think there's a large space for education. But the other piece is, if they love them so much and the cops are in favor with this, have the cops step down, resign from the police force, get retrained, and come back into the community as a liaison. Mm-hmm. You don't have to be a police officer, because that power differential, you can be my friend until you're not. Mm-hmm. When you use information that I've shared with you against my family, young people don't know that if they have not had that interaction with them. And also young people that have had interactions with the police outside in the streets, and it's not that SRO, when they come into the school, they don't feel that connection with them, but they're afraid to share that. The other piece is that with the SRO, they're talking about relationships. And if we want to talk about relationships, they have divested from social workers, they have divested from counselors, but they alone are not the ones that are going to give the answer. What we need to do is have our white teachers have relationships with the young students, if we're going to talk about where we need to start. And so let's not push it off on our young people, or our families are afraid of what happens, because what we have done as a society is interrupt our ability to imagine a different world for our children, and therefore we accept what is right in front of us. And I cannot accept it at this time, because the status quo is not helping anybody. And so it's my job to help elevate, like by having this conversation with you. We may not agree, but this needs to get people talking about what is the expectation for a relationship in my school. And the second thing that I need to address is that folks say they don't feel safe in their schools without an SRO. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But the SRO is not able to prevent, like the whole point is because of relationships, they're able to prevent things from happening. And if you look at the data, that is not the case. Mm-hmm. So there's a myth about what happens with SROs. And the other thing that we need to address is that our principals, who have been trained specifically because of the agreement with the Office of Civil Rights about the use of SROs, is they're calling them for reasons that are in opposition to the policy that we have established. So I have a family, a young man that was arrested by an SRO because his friend grabbed a number of juice boxes from the cafeteria. Mm-hmm. He gave his friends the juice boxes. The police officer went in their lockers and he arrested the young person for that juice box. And so if you actually look at the data of what are the interactions that our police are having with our students in schools, that is unacceptable. Mm-hmm. And that young man had to apologize and go through that experience. And not to mention that his parents were not called when he was arrested and taken away, or not arrested, but handled and taken down to the juvenile detention center. So I think we need to dispel this myth that our police officers are actually making this a safer place. And one of the places of accountability lands on our principals, who continue to call on them to do something that is in their role, that is not even in the job description of a school resource officer.
Yeah, so Minneapolis public school principals are terrible. There was a principals academy years ago that was paid for by Cargill. It produced absolutely zero good principals after a big try. What the district figured out was it didn't know what a good principal was. So even though they were setting up these trainings, they were going to create an academy that was going to create great principals and turn them out. And we were going to suddenly have an influx of great principals in Minneapolis public schools. Never happened. Millions of dollars wasted. District figured out that it has very low competence on anything, but specifically on producing what a good principal is. It's not to say that there aren't some principals in Minneapolis public schools that are amazing. Then there's a group of them that are mediocre. And then there's a group of them that shouldn't be running anything, including a 7-Eleven. So that is.
We have a tendency to fail people up.
Yeah, we feel, I call them disciplinary promotions. If you're bad at one thing in Minneapolis public schools, you eventually get promoted for it.
Okay, I need to write that down. Hold on a second.
Yeah, so the district headquarters is full of disciplinary promotions. Teachers that couldn't teach, so they put them on special assignment, or principals that couldn't be a principal, so they make them a superintendent of some sort, or it's just like it's a crap fest. It's a turd blossom at the school district there. So when we expect good things from them, like to do right by us in our community, I think you're hitting on, to me, an answer, which is when you say that the power has to be in community groups outside working with the districts and putting pressure on them.
That have demonstrated.
Yeah,
that have demonstrated the work, not just the partners and the allies that have been there, the whole status quo.
Well, and you know, that's another thing about Minneapolis. I don't know anybody listening or watching. I don't know what it's like in your city. You can tell me in the comments if it's any different. But in our system of power within Minneapolis and the Twin Cities, the nonprofit sector plays a big part, and the people who do the best in the nonprofit sector are people who have very good relationships with the power base itself, with the system itself, and aren't necessarily always doing anything more than eating steak dinners on the backs of the people that they say that they represent. So maybe that's different where you live, but that's clearly the way that it is here in the Twin Cities. Marika, you've seen things like across the country, and I have too. So I'm only being slightly facetious when I say maybe it's different where you are. I want to share something with those listening or watching. Here's my screen. I just want to share this with you guys real quick. This is a student coming to St. Paul Central High School. Apparently was visiting a friend. It was getting close to the end of the year. I think it was like, you know, part of the senior days type of thing, and was coming back to school. I forgot the big story here. But
so I can give you context later on that.
You can give me context. An intern from the Unitarian Church happened to be there and filmed this school resource officer interacting with this student who was coming back to see friends, you know, for like some sort of senior days.
I was coming to talk to a teacher. I was coming to talk to her. Get your hands behind your back. Now. I can't, nigga. My hands are stuck behind the fucking. Let me unstick them then. What is wrong with you? What the fuck, man? Hey, yo. Put your other hand. I can't, bitch. You fucking owe me. Get off of me. Please help me. Help me. Help. Help. Put your other hand. I can't. You are on my back. Help. Get your other hand. Help. Out. Dude, turn that off. Help. No. Hey, don't get the fuck off. No. I can't even talk to a teacher. Get up. I came to talk to a teacher. I can record him along too. You good, bro? I came to talk to a teacher. It's all right. I have no drugs on me, no weapons, nothing. What the fuck is going on? What the fuck is wrong with you? Why they on that with my man G, man? Yo, you see this shit? I see you, bro. You fucking see this shit? I got maced.
That looked very therapeutic.
Correct.
You know, that looks like exactly what we want to see in our schools. Looks awesome. This cop actually looks like somebody who's very specially trained to work with students and kids. So, you know.
So can I just say a few words about that?
You know about this story, so I'll ask you for context on it a little bit, but this isn't a rare story. But I do want to say this one thing about this. All of it bothers me, but one of the things that bothers me the most is I think I remember it was the principal that was telling the person who was filming this to stop filming it. Hey, put that away, trying to get the person. And this isn't a student who was filming it. This is an intern at the Unitarian Church who was actually filming this. And the principal was trying to get that person to stop documenting the brutalizing of a child in the Twin Cities schools, where we are like so progressive. We are like so amazing and with our progressivism and whatnot. Give me context. What did I just see here? What was I seeing?
So that was a school police officer who had been at Central High School and had a track record of not necessarily tasing, but treatment of students like that. And so the Pan-African Student Association was led by 3 young African-American girls that we worked with as a response to that, because that was the one that was visible. Mm-hmm. And so these 3 young folks that were on the Pan-African Student Advisory, they met with the school board. They had a march. They met with the school and security staff over at St. Paul Public Schools. And so they were able to see a bit of change, but like you're speaking to, there's not the systemic change. So they were able to get rid of that SRO. And they actually operated as a school for the first 6 months without an SRO. Unfortunately, that SRO was just moved to another location.
Same cop. So he was moved to a different
Yeah, so okay. that is that same tendency to move people around when there's an issue that shows up. And then their solution was, well, they'll get along better if they just don't wear their uniform and they wear blue t-shirts. And so that is kind of thinking that we have been up against in these school districts when our students are on the board, they have the student advisory, and they're telling the district and they're telling the school board that this is what's happening, and they're not listening. So what I want to talk about to you is that this is not the solution, but with that vote in Minneapolis around ending the contract with the Minneapolis Police Department, our young representative did not have a vote. And so a part of this issue is that we put young people in physical positions of power, but no actual power. And so one of our demands is, if you are going to have young people and that are contributing to the governance of our district, that they need to have a vote, and that there needs to be more than one student representative that is on the board, so they are not targeted for standing up. Because that young man had a petition from thousands of Minneapolis public school students, families, and teachers to present amendments or to bring to the table the call to even have the conversation. And they continue to get shut down, as they did over in St. Paul when that happened with that police officer. They coddled the young people until they graduated, they moved on, and then they just continued to do that work. And so it takes us back to that status quo of the people who have been in these positions of power within these districts that have actually been harming the people that have been pushing back against these unjust and inequitable policies and practices.
I want to point out that the student here was Darian Bell, actually, and he had transferred to the High School of Recording Arts, which I have a good friend and colleague who works there. That school for years has been a school, I think their average freshman age for students is 19 in a high school. And these are kids that generally have often been failed by the traditional district system. They are the school was founded by one of Prince's musicians who wanted to help kids in the city, and for years has been serving kids that oftentimes get pushed out of the traditional district schools. And this kid had recently transferred from Central High School in St. Paul to that school and was coming back to see friends.
And a beloved teacher, and a beloved teacher that everybody had loved, Jan Mendel, who was like an arts and performing teacher. There was a conversation about the visit.
So say more. What do you mean there was a conversation about him coming to visit?
Yes,
like he had prior ability
to like
to
the
be
teacher
there.
was anticipating his arrival.
Oh, really? I didn't know that part. So, what annoys me most about what you just said, too, was that there was activism. There was like marches. Students really came together. It became a rallying cry. They did everything they were supposed to do, be active, involved, activists and citizens. They got the officer out of there. And from what you just told me, they moved him to a different place, to a different building. I also want to say that St. Paul, where this happened, is one of the Twin Cities, so that people know. We talk about Minneapolis and St. Paul often like they are they're the same place. But I wanted to tell this from or as if they're different places. They're really connected. But I want to tell this from the teacher's perspective here. So I'm going to share my screen again so that you can see this. So you see here. So there's a teacher in St. Paul named Aaron Benner.
Aaron Benner no longer there.
He's no longer there, but he was a Black teacher in St. Paul Public School. Which is really interesting. You'll have to tell me which charter he's in right now. So this is Aaron Benner. Aaron Benner was a teacher in the St. Paul Public Schools who was put on the news because he was speaking publicly about how Black kids in the St. Paul Public Schools are thugs, and how there wasn't a race problem. It had nothing to do with discriminatory practices within the district or within the policies and how they were applied. It had to do with the fact that Black children were out of control. They were thugs. They were acting thuggish, and it wasn't the teacher's fault, and that we needed to pay more attention to correcting the kids rather than any other focal point, which at that time, the focal point was on putting teachers through equity training, and they were resisting, and he was the leader of their resistance. He was eventually fired because he was a low-performing teacher, apparently, that the district had reason to fire, they said. And he eventually sued them and won $500,000 in a settlement against them because they saw it as retaliation for him speaking out publicly. But I mean, man, you had a black teacher in a school district standing out saying, like, listen, this isn't about race. This is about how bad these kids are. Marika, you know that he's not the only guy to say stuff like that. You know, he's not the only teacher that's going to feel like that. Do you give them any credibility to what they're saying?
Actually, I don't, because I want to go back to the research. I was on an advisory with St. Paul Public Schools because they were grappling with the same horrible suspension rates. And so we did a survey of all of the administrators, teachers, parents, and youth. And so what we got out of that was not our young people are out of control. It was, I'm afraid that I am going to be ostracized by my peers if I buy into this. And so many people that have wanted to stand up have felt intimidated in doing so and calling people out like Aaron, because Aaron had issues for years within the district. Like, this was not a new, I think he had issues with race in his classroom. And so when we look at the data and what people are communicating, I don't think it actually makes it to the conversation about where people are versus a knee-jerk reaction to, we got to get them out now, and this is the only solution, and we're going to do it like that. So I think about going back to like Bernadette Johnson. Like, she didn't like have a roadmap when she decided to do the moratorium, because to be able to enact that type of change, you have to move quickly. You can't get people to buy in because they'll shut it down and they'll drag it out. So oftentimes, even like Valeria, who was the superintendent of St. Paul at that time, had to do a very similar action to even be able to move the needle at all. And so you see those people being eliminated from their roles so that they don't have to be held to, the districts don't have to be held to account. So again, there have been people in place that have been trying to make these changes, but their voices are silenced and they're eliminated from the process. And that is not to say that they were perfect people or perfect leaders. But at that moment, they took a courageous step and they were penalized for it. I mean, we see that across the country with superintendents that have been elevating the conversation about equity.
Yeah, I think that's because Minnesota hates black children. But I think you keep making my point for me. You keep like saying that we had a person in place, but the system fought back. We had a committee and the system fought back, or we had a community group that was doing the good work in the district, but the district fought back. You just mentioned the superintendent. Valeria Silva was the superintendent of St. Paul for a while. I've had Valeria on a previous show and was supportive of her work, even though I wasn't always supportive of her, pro-district stance on everything. Yeah. But Valeria had done a lot of really deep kind of research on the equity problems within the district and where there was a need for work. She had come up through the district. She had come to this country and learned to speak English in a very short amount of time, eventually ended up as an aide within the district and worked her way all the way up to superintendent. And when she put in the equity programs, the white teachers of St. Paul freaked out because suddenly they were being made to go to trainings. They were being made to investigate kind of their practices. They were made to do things that they had never been made to do before, and they were not having it. And the St. Paul Federation of Teachers and the teachers themselves fought the district tooth and nail like the party of no on every equity thing that she put together. And when they couldn't get anywhere, they formed a coalition with white parents in St. Paul. They ran a slate of school board candidates. They won because it was union backed and white parent and privilege backed. And they got they won the school board, the entire board, and they fired Valeria Silva, all because of her equity plan, not because of achievement or anything else. They paid her $700 and something thousand to walk away from the district. They didn't fire her like you or I get fired. When you or I get fired, we're just broke, right? We just walk away with nothing. She walked away with almost $1 million. And I thought, wow, it is worth almost $1 million in a district that's always talking about being underfunded just to get a pro-equity superintendent out of there. Wow, these teachers must be really powerful.
Chris, but here's the story that is not told about what happened in that exit, is that they also opened up the doors of a overly punitive behavioral disorder. Like they released students from a lot of these contained units, and that was the uproar of the teachers. And what I like to lift up in that conversation is that of the students that they mainstreamed in that move that Superintendent Silva did, was that 80% of those students shouldn't have been there in the first place. 20% of those students should have been receiving personalized services to meet them where their disability was at. And so we hear about the money, we hear about Valeria Silva, but the young people that have been isolated and separated from their peers because they were labeled to be behavioral issues, to be disability that was disruptive to the classroom. What they found was 80% of those young people should not have been there in the first place. And the reaction of the teachers union was that they didn't get to be a part of the decision, that many of the teachers understood that that was happening and had been advocating. So there's a tension between the leadership of the union and the union members itself.
Well,
20 years ago, I was a member of that union, but I didn't have any connection to it. I didn't know what was going on. I was completely disconnected from that conversation.
Well, you shouldn't have told me that, Marika. I didn't know that about you, that you used to be part of that union. You shouldn't have told me that.
You're automatically a part of that union if you're...
So let's give context to our people listening and watching. If you're not from here, there was a plan when Valeria was there to mainstream students that had been in special education programs that possibly had just been put there as a way to warehouse them and to move them out of classrooms where teachers didn't want them. What is really interesting, the nuance, I sat in on a public meeting where the public came to give comments about this plan to mainstream a bunch of these students, and teachers showed up in mass, and they were like, they were just like, basically they were against it. They didn't want these kids back in their classrooms. But when I say they, let me not be too general, because the teachers that were working with those students in special education showed up to say that they didn't think that their students should be exiled from regular classrooms. They came to speak in favor of their students being integrated into regular classrooms because they thought it was an inequity that the kids they served were not they weren't in this special ed because there was anything wrong with them or whatever, right?
Yes. Thank you for saying it so eloquently, because I couldn't get it out.
But those teachers got shouted down.
And many of them have left the district.
And I can find the video if anybody ever wants to see it. Believe me, there are receipts to the things that I say. And those teachers got shouted down by a bunch of angry white middle-aged teachers who were damn near pension age, which, by the way, I got to keep saying this for the people that watch this, because I'm never going to stop saying this until it changes. The St. Paul Federation of Teachers has their pension funding, or their pension fund, invested in private prisons and child detention centers and companies that charge inmates in incredible prices, crazy prices for things like phone calls to call their family home. The St. Paul Federation of Teachers, who oversee classrooms that don't educate Black children or children of color, period, well at all, literally have their pension fund and their lives vested in the misery of those children that will happen after they leave St. Paul Public Schools. I'm never going to stop saying that until they change it. I'm going to keep saying that over and over and over again until they do something about that. So we're coming up towards the end here. We got to wrap up in a couple of minutes. You and I have this conversation a lot, and we've been having it for a long time. I generally agree with you. I agree with you on the science, on the ideas, on the basis. You and I probably agree on how crazy incompetent these districts are in some ways. You probably wouldn't use that word. I use that word. I'm not going to put that on you. I can say it because I can't be fired locally, so I can say that. But what would you say to the people that have concerns? They want to see more equitable schools. They just might be a little bit nervous about whether or not SROs, removing them from the schools, are going to make kids more or less safe.
I would ask them to interrupt the logic that SROs have made our schools safe. I don't believe they have improved or increased our culture and our climate. And what you hear and what I hear when folks even that support SROs is that they like the relationship. And so let's take that relationship piece out and focus on where are the most meaningful relationships for young people and the families, and let's invest our resources there.
That's a great point. If it really is about relationships and these officers have really good relationships with the students, then let's reconceive the role. Let's think of the role differently.
Retrain. Yeah. We're not looking for security officers because, again, you're hearing a small voice of people that say they feel safe, but in general, many of our students are experiencing police violence out in the streets, and to have that continue into their learning environment feels like a level of surveillance that many of us did not grow up with and was not the norm. And now it's become the norm, and now it's acceptable, and we need to interrupt that thinking because this is not how education is supposed to bring about change for our society. We need to reimagine a liberatory approach to doing this, and it's not going to happen from the inside. It has to happen from us calling to account, providing solutions from the outside, and calling to account those people in the community that continue to collect money but don't demonstrate any type of change but maintain relationships with these systems that hold the status quo.
That's a great place to stop. Marika Pfefferkorn is a co-founder of the Twin Cities Innovation Alliance. She's also done work with Dignity in Schools, a national campaign to rethink the way that we do discipline in schools. Was the founding executive director of the Midwest Center for School Transformation. While we have been talking, you have seen that Marika's Twitter handle has been going across the bottom. So if you want to find her, you can find her on Twitter just by no one else I know ever in the world that I've ever seen has the last name Pfefferkorn. So if you actually just Google Pfefferkorn or on Twitter, you'll find it.
Pfefferkorn 42. M Pfefferkorn 42 is my Twitter handle.
Her Twitter handle, and you can find her there. I know you have another call coming up. I really appreciate you coming on today. You're such like a long-termer on this issue. I trust and respect your opinion on this. It's my job to play devil's advocate a lot of times.
I appreciate it. It helps the level of my sophistication as we have these conversations, because if I can tackle Chris, everybody else better get out the way. So thank you for this time and have a wonderful day.
Appreciate it.
Thank
Marika,
you, everybody.
Good luck with your day. And then everybody else listening and watching, if you have any more resources or thoughts about this particular issue, go ahead and send them to me, Christopher@activist.com. As always, I love you guys for watching every day, for participating, for making the show better, and just for being so loyal to the idea that we can have respectful, honest conversations about education in the United States without ripping each other apart. This is supposed to be a thinking person's show. I don't have any disposition one way or the other about the way they should go. I'll interview anybody. You're going to see in coming shows that I will be interviewing people that, you know, I may or may not agree with, you may or may not disagree with. But the fact of the matter is there are millions of children of all colors, ages, walks of life that are entering into public schools who are not being treated well, aren't being set up well for success. And it's the adults in the United States that are responsible for that. We are the adults. We're part of that group. So whether or not we're educators, we still have a role to play in their success. I appreciate you all. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being committed. Please help keep us honest and send any ideas or thoughts that you have to me.